He found her sleeping under a bridge in the rain with a stolen textbook tucked under her arm to keep it dry. He was the most feared man in Seoul's criminal underworld. She was 9 years old and hadn't eaten in 3 days. 13 years later, she walked into the most important courtroom in the country and saved everything he'd built. And she did it wearing the suit he'd bought her for law school graduation. If you've ever been chosen by someone who didn't have to choose you, stay until the end. This one's for you. Before we go anywhere, if you're new here, hit subscribe because we tell stories like this every week and you do not want to miss what's coming next month. Now, let's get into it. The bridge was on the eastern edge of the Han River, in a part of the city that the redevelopment plans had not yet reached, and that the city's social services had apparently given up on entirely. Kwon Sung-jin was not supposed to be there at 11:30 on a Wednesday night in November. He was supposed to be at a meeting 2 blocks away, and he was running 7 minutes late, which was something that essentially never happened, and which he was going to address with considerable irritability the moment he arrived. What made him late by an additional 40 minutes was a small, soaked figure huddled against the bridge support with a plastic bag wrapped around a library book, sleeping in the rain with the absolute animal efficiency of someone who had learned to sleep anywhere, under any conditions, because the alternative was not sleeping at all. He stood over her for a full minute before she woke. When she did, she didn't scream. She didn't run. She looked up at him with the particular flat-eyed assessment of a child who had already encountered enough dangerous people to recognize the category and had long since decided that panic was less useful than observation. "You're blocking the dry part," she said. He looked down at his Italian leather shoes, standing precisely in the only section of the underpass that the bridge above was keeping rain-free. He stepped aside. She pulled the plastic bag off her book, checked the cover, a secondary school mathematics textbook, 3 years above her apparent age, and tucked it back under her arm. "Are you going to call someone?" she asked. "Who would you like me to call?" "Nobody," she said immediately. "I've been in 3 different group homes this year. I'm not going back." "What's your name?" She considered whether to answer with the pragmatic suspicion of someone who had learned that information had value, and giving it away without return was poor economics. "Mia," she said finally. "What's yours?" He told her. She recognized it. He could see it in the fractional widening of her eyes, the slight recalibration of her expression. And instead of fear, what crossed her face was something closer to a very tired, very young calculation. "Are you going to hurt me?" she asked. "No." "Are you going to make me do something?" "No." "Then what do you want?" It was, he would think later, exactly the right question. The question of someone who understood, at 9 years old, that adults who approached homeless children under bridges at midnight generally wanted something, and that the only honest response to charity was to identify its price up front. He found himself, despite the meeting he was already 40 minutes late for, unable to produce an answer that satisfied either of them. "I want to know why you're keeping a mathematics textbook dry when you're soaking wet," he said finally. She looked at him with an expression that suggested she found this both a reasonable question and faintly absurd. "Because I can dry. The book can't." Kwon Sung-jin, who had spent the better part of 15 years building an organization that the Korean authorities considered one of the most sophisticated and impenetrable criminal enterprises on the peninsula, stood under a bridge in the rain and felt something shift in the machinery of his chest in a way he was entirely unprepared for. He had a daughter once, briefly, impossibly, for 4 years and 11 days before the fever took her, in a hospital room he would never fully forgive himself for not being present in. He had told himself for 5 years since that the particular space that loss had left in him was simply part of the architecture of who he was now. The small, soaked, unbothered girl in front of him was making that argument considerably harder to maintain. "Come with me," he said. "I'll get you food. You can leave afterward if you want to." She thought about this with the same careful pragmatism she appeared to bring to everything. "What kind of food?" "Whatever kind you want." Another pause. "Tteokbokki," she said, "the real kind. Not the convenience store kind." "The real kind," he agreed. She stood up, tucked the mathematics book more securely under her arm, and looked at him with 9 years of hard-won wariness, and something underneath it that he recognized, from a very long time ago, as the specific hope of someone who had stopped letting themselves hope and was doing it anyway despite everything. "If you try anything," she said, "I bite." "I don't doubt it," Kwon Sung-jin said, and walked her out of the rain. "If you're already feeling this one, drop a comment letting me know. This story is one of my favorites we've ever told. Now, back to it. He didn't try anything. What he did over the following 72 hours was considerably harder to explain to the men who worked for him than anything violent would have been. He installed her in one of the guest rooms of his house, a house she walked through with wide, carefully controlled eyes, touching nothing, cataloging everything. And he called a doctor and a tutor, and then, on the third day, a lawyer who specialized in the particular bureaucratic maze of Korean child welfare law. "What are you doing?" His second-in-command, Park Dae-hyun, asked him, with the expression of a man who had followed Kwon Sung-jin into and out of a number of situations he didn't fully understand, but who felt on this particular occasion that he was obligated to ask. "Getting her out of the group home system," Kwon said. And then she'll have somewhere to live that isn't under a bridge." Dae-hyun looked at the closed door of the guest room, behind which the sounds of a 9-year-old working through a mathematics textbook were faintly audible. "She's going to complicate things." "Most things worth doing complicate things," Kwon said. "Arrange the paperwork." The adoption was finalized 7 months later, after a process that had involved considerably more creative navigation of the legal system than Kwon usually engaged in. He preferred in his professional life to simply make obstacles cease to exist, rather than climb over them. But the family court judge assigned to the case had an impeccable record and an absolute immunity to the kind of pressure his organization usually applied, and Kwon had found himself doing something he hadn't done in a very long time, playing by the rules, completely, because the thing he was trying to protect was worth doing correctly. Mia stood beside him in the courthouse hallway afterward, still wearing the slightly too large cardigan she'd chosen herself from the 3 options he'd offered her, holding a paper cup of hot chocolate she'd negotiated for before agreeing to wear anything formal at all, and looked at the adoption certificate with an expression he still couldn't fully read. "Does this mean I have to call you Dad?" she asked. "You can call me whatever you'd like," he said. She thought about it for a long moment. "Abeoji," she said finally, the formal Korean term for father, said in the tone of someone testing the weight of a word they'd never used before and finding it tentatively, like something they might want to keep. Something happened in Kwon Sung-jin's chest that he was not going to describe to anyone. 13 years passed. Mia grew up in the complicated, specific way that children who have survived hard things grow up, with a pragmatism that no amount of security entirely erased, and a ferocity that the security only made more directed. She excelled at school with the particular intensity of someone who understood, at a bone-deep level, exactly what education was for. She asked questions that made Kwon's tutors visibly uncomfortable and his lawyers visibly intrigued. She argued with him about everything: his business decisions, his risk management, his diet, the specific brand of stubbornness that he apparently passed on through environment rather than genetics. And she was right often enough that he had learned to listen, even when he didn't want to. She went to university at 18 and law school at 22, and somewhere in the years of contracts and case studies and moot court arguments, she developed the particular skill that would come to matter most: the ability to find the single thread in a complex legal fabric that, when pulled correctly, unraveled the entire opposing case. She was working at a mid-sized firm in Seoul, 18 months into her career and already being noticed by people considerably more senior than her when her father was arrested. The charges were significant: criminal enterprise, money laundering across 6 jurisdictions, and the one that was designed to stick regardless of how the others went: conspiracy to commit murder in connection with the death of a rival organization's second-in-command 3 years earlier. The prosecution had evidence Kwon's own lawyers couldn't immediately explain: wire transfers in his name, encrypted communications bearing his digital signature, testimony from an inside source who had apparently been providing information for 18 months. Kwon called Mia from the detention facility at 11:30 at night, the same hour and almost the exact location where she had once looked up at him from under a bridge and asked if he was going to hurt her. "I didn't do it," he said when she picked up. "The murder. I need you to know that first, before anything else. I have done a great many things in my life that I won't insult you by denying, but I did not order that man's death." "I know," Mia said without hesitation. "I've known since the day it happened. You were in Busan. I have the receipts, literally. You made me track the catering expenses for the Busan conference because Dae-hyun's accounting was a mess. I have time-stamped documentation of your location for every hour of that entire weekend." A pause from his end. "You kept those." "I keep everything, Abeoji. You taught me that." Another pause, longer, heavier. "The evidence they have?" Was manufactured, she said. I don't know by whom yet. But the wire transfers were routed through an entity that didn't exist in your holding structure until 14 months ago, which means someone built it specifically to frame you. The digital signatures on the encrypted communications are 12 days newer than the metadata on the communications themselves, which means they were added retroactively. And the inside source? She paused. The inside source is the most interesting problem, because whoever he is, he has enough genuine knowledge of your operations to be credible, which means he's been inside the organization for a long time, and nobody manufactures that kind of access in 18 months. He's not a plant. He's a traitor who found a partner. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man who had spent 30 years being several moves ahead of every opponent he'd ever faced, hearing his 22-year-old daughter be further ahead than him. I'm going to represent you, Mia said. Not as lead counsel. You need a senior partner for the courtroom, and I know exactly who to call. But I'm going to be at that table, and I'm going to find the thread. I always find the thread. Mia, you stood in the rain for 40 minutes instead of going to your meeting, she said. You fed me tteokbokki, and you got me out of the group home system, and you learned to read my mathematics textbooks so you could help me with homework, even though you didn't need mathematics for anything you actually did professionally. You did all of that when you didn't have to, for someone you'd known for less than a week. Her voice was steady, the voice she'd developed in courtrooms and boardrooms, and every room that had tried to make her feel smaller than she was. I've been waiting 13 years for a problem I could actually solve for you. This is that problem. Let me do it. The senior partner she called was Han Ji-soo, 61 years old, the most decorated criminal defense attorney in South Korea, and the only person Mia trusted to stand in a courtroom and hold the space she needed while she worked behind it. Han had watched Mia argue 2 cases earlier in her career with the expression of a woman who had seen a great many talented young lawyers and was now seeing something considerably rarer. You want me to be the face? Han said, when Mia laid out the arrangement. I want you to be the sword, Mia said. I'll hand you everything you need. I just need time to find it. How much time? The preliminary hearing is in 3 weeks. I need 2. Han looked at her across the table with the particular assessment of someone deciding whether a bet is worth making. Your father is Kwon Sung-jin. He is. The prosecution's lead is Kim Woo-seok. I've watched him try 11 cases. He hasn't lost one. He's never had a case where the evidence was manufactured by someone inside the defense's own organization, Mia said. He's prosecuting a fabrication. He just doesn't know it yet, and neither does whoever built it, because if they knew I was the one pulling it apart, they would have moved faster. Han studied her for one more long moment. Then she said, 2 weeks. Don't be late. The offices Mia set up for the defense investigation were not the firm's official conference rooms, too visible, too many people who talked, but 3 rooms in a building 2 blocks away that Dae Yun's people quietly secured and swept for anything electronic within the first 6 hours. She worked from 7 in the morning until past midnight for 12 consecutive days, building the evidentiary architecture of the frame backward from its current state to the point of origin. The wire transfer entity, a shell company called Heian Capital, had been incorporated in the Cayman Islands 14 months earlier, with a registration agent whose client list she traced, after 4 days of careful work, to a law firm in Singapore whose primary retainer client was the Shin organization. The Shin family had been the Kwon organization's primary rival in Seoul for 11 years. Not enemies exactly, the kind of careful, structured competition that existed between organizations sophisticated enough to understand that open war cost more than it gained. And they had a particular reason to want Kwon Sung-jin removed from the board. A major infrastructure development project, worth a number that had several zeros, was currently caught between the 2 families' competing interests, and with Kwon in prison, the Shin organization's path to it cleared completely. It was, Mia thought, the oldest motive in existence. Money, dressed up in complexity because the people involved were intelligent enough to know that simple plots left simple trails. The traitor inside the organization was harder. She went through the inside source's testimony 3 times, identifying every piece of genuine operational knowledge embedded in it, and cross-referenced each piece against the list of people who could have known it. The list got shorter each time. On the 9th day, it had 2 names on it. She eliminated the first by the end of the 9th day. The second name she sat with for a very long time, because it was a name she knew, a man who had worked for her father for 9 years, who had been present at her adoption proceedings, who had, on one occasion she still remembered clearly, driven her to a hospital at 3 in the morning when she was 16 and had a fever her father was too far away to come home for. The betrayal didn't make her angry exactly. It made her something colder and more useful. The specific, focused clarity of someone who has identified the last piece of a problem and can now see exactly how to use it. If you're following this closely, you might already see where this is going. Drop your prediction in the comments. I love when you're right. Now, back to the story. He found her on the 11th day. Mia was working late in the investigation office alone, everyone else sent home for the night, when the door opened and a man she didn't immediately recognize walked in, stopped when he saw her, and then stood very still in the way people stand when they've arrived somewhere expecting to find it empty and are now rapidly recalculating. He was about her age. Korean, well-dressed in the specific way of someone who had grown up around money but hadn't spent their adult life performing it. Sharp-featured, observant, and she noted this with the same efficiency she noted everything, visibly more alarmed by her presence than by the security breach that her presence implied about his own intelligence. "You're Kwan's daughter," he said. "And you're Shin Jae-hoon," she said, "the second son. You handle the legal compliance side of the Shin organization's legitimate businesses. You have a law degree from Yonsei, which is where I got mine, 2 years ahead of me. You've been trying to find this office for 4 days." She tilted her head slightly. "You're not here to threaten me. If you were, you'd have brought people. So what do you want?" Shin Jae-hoon looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Not hostility, not attraction exactly. Something more complicated than either, the look of a man encountering something he hadn't built a file for. "My father didn't order the frame," he said. "I want you to know that before anything else, because what you're building in this room is going to implicate the Shin organization, and I need you to understand the distinction." "Tell me who did." "My older brother." He said it with the flat, careful control of someone who has already spent a long time processing a grief they don't have words for yet. "Shin Woo-jin. He controls the infrastructure division. He made the deal with your father's trader without my father's knowledge, and he built Heian Capital without running it through our legal compliance process, which is how I found it." A pause. "My father is 72 years old and has prostate cancer that we haven't announced publicly. Woo-jin has been making decisions for 3 months that my father doesn't fully know about. This is one of them." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your father didn't order that murder, and my brother did. Not with his hands, but he built the situation that made it happen, and then used it as a weapon against someone who wasn't responsible for it." His jaw tightened. "I have spent my entire professional life building legitimate structures around an organization that operates in gray areas because I believe the gray areas can be managed without anyone innocent getting destroyed. What my brother did is not that. It is simply wrong, and I am not willing to let it stand." Mia studied him for a long, careful moment, running every variable she could identify about him and his presence in this room through the same analytical process she brought to everything. "If I use what you're telling me," she said, "it will implicate your brother in a way that cannot be walked back. It will likely implicate your father's organization by association, even if your father is personally uninvolved. It will fundamentally alter the balance of what exists between our two families, and I don't yet know what it alters it into." "I know," Shin Jae-hoon said. "I've thought about all of that. And the alternative is watching an innocent man go to prison for something my family's blood is on, however indirectly." He met her eyes with a steadiness she hadn't expected and found herself respecting despite every instinct that told her to be careful about respecting a Shin. "I can give you documentation, wire transfer authorizations in my brother's name, communications between him and your father's trader going back 16 months. Enough to not just create doubt, enough to prove the frame specifically and completely in a way that leaves no room for interpretation. What do you want in return?" "Nothing from you, nothing from your father." A pause. "I want my brother stopped. Whatever that means for him legally, I've made my peace with it. I just want it done by someone who will do it correctly, and you are clearly that person." Mia was quiet for a long moment, then she said, "Leave the documentation with me. I'll verify it independently before I use any of it. If it's what you say it is, I'll make sure the distinction between your brother's actions and your father's organization is as clear as the evidence allows." "That's all I'm asking. One more thing." She looked at him with the directness she brought to everything. "Why did you come yourself? You could have sent someone. You could have left the documentation anonymously." Shin Jae-hoon was quiet for a moment that told her he'd asked himself the same question and hadn't fully resolved it yet. I wanted to see if you were as good as the people who've watched you in court say you are, he said finally. I needed to know I was handing this to the right person. And something shifted in his expression, the specific adjustment of someone recalibrating their estimate upward. I think I probably should have come 3 days earlier, he said. You'd already found most of it, hadn't you? Most, she confirmed. You filled in the last piece. He nodded once, the nod of someone concluding a negotiation that had gone, against his expectations, exactly as it needed to. He left the documentation on her desk and walked out, and Mia sat alone in the quiet of the investigation office and understood, with the clarity that came after the last piece of a very complex problem clicked into place, that everything that happened next was simply execution. She was very good at execution. The courtroom on the day of the preliminary hearing was the kind of room that had been designed, consciously or not, to make defendants feel small. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, a bench elevated enough that the judge looked down on everyone present, including the prosecution team that arrived with the particular confidence of people who had never seriously considered losing. Kim Woo-seok, the prosecution lead, was exactly what his record suggested. Calm, precise, organized in a way that left almost no visible surface for challenge to gain purchase on. He had 11 consecutive wins because he built cases that looked, from every angle, complete. He had never, in 11 cases, prosecuted a fabrication, which meant he had never had to account for the specific vulnerability of evidence that looked complete precisely because it had been constructed to. Kwon Sung-jin sat at the defense table in a dark suit and the particular stillness of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the most dangerous presence in any room he entered and was now, for the first time in 30 years, the most vulnerable one. He had not looked at Mia when she took her seat beside Han Ji-soo. She understood, without needing it said, that this was not coldness. It was the specific inability of a man who had never once, in 30 years, asked anyone for help, to look at the person he was asking for it without losing something he'd spent 30 years maintaining. She opened her notebook. She let Han Ji-soo handle the first 2 hours. The prosecution laid out its case with the methodical precision of people who believed their evidence was what it appeared to be. The wire transfers from Heian Capital, presented as definitive. The encrypted communications bearing Kwon's digital signature, presented as forensically verified. The inside source appearing via protected testimony, presented as credible, specific, damning. Kim Woo-seok had constructed a very convincing building. He simply hadn't known the foundation had been dug by someone else. Han Ji-soo conducted the cross-examination of the prosecution's digital forensics expert with the documentation Mia had prepared, and Mia watched the expert's confidence erode in real time as Han laid the 12-day discrepancy between the communication metadata and the digital signature timestamps in front of him and asked, with perfect calm, whether he could account for it. He couldn't. He tried. He couldn't. The wire transfer chain came apart on the second cross-examination when Han introduced the Cayman Islands registration documents for Heian Capital and the Singapore law firm, connection to the Shin organization's legitimate business interests, not as proof of conspiracy precisely, but as proof that the entity used to route the transfers had a provenance entirely disconnected from Kwon Sung-jin's existing financial structure, which was the kind of detail a man committing actual financial crimes would not leave hanging loose. Kim Woo-seok was good enough to pivot quickly, redirecting toward the inside source as his most defensible remaining ground. The inside source's testimony couldn't be directly impeached in the same way. It was experiential, subjective, and the source's genuine knowledge of the organization made it credible in ways that were harder to dismantle purely through documentary evidence. This was the piece Mia had been waiting for. She stood up. Han Ji-soo looked at her once, a look that said she had the floor, and sat back. The courtroom noticed her in the way courtrooms notice the moment when the weight of a proceeding shifts, not loudly, but with the particular collective adjustment of people whose attention has been redirected by something they can't immediately explain. "Your Honor," Mia said, and her voice in the courtroom was the same voice she'd been developing since she was 9 years old and had decided, under a bridge in the rain, that her intelligence was the only thing she reliably owned. "I'd like to introduce Defense Exhibit 37 through 44, which are direct communications between the prosecution's protected inside source and Shin Woo-jin, the eldest son of the Shin organization's current leadership, spanning a period of 16 months beginning 2 months before the inside source's initial contact with the prosecution." The sound that went through the courtroom was not loud. It was the specific, dense quiet of a room full of people recalibrating simultaneously. Kim Woo-seok looked at the exhibits as they were distributed with the expression of a man who had just understood, very quickly, that the building he had constructed was not standing on the ground he thought it was. Objection, Your Honor. The defense cannot authenticate. The authentication documentation is Exhibit 45 through 51, Mia said. Independent forensic verification of the communications provenance, conducted by a firm with no connection to either the defense or the Shin organization, completed 72 hours ago. The chain of custody is unbroken. Subscribe now if you haven't already, because this is the kind of story we tell every single week, and the next one is already coming. Now, let's finish this. The exhibits went in. Han Ji-soo presented them with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 40 years in rooms like this and had learned that the most devastating arguments were the ones delivered without drama. Mia sat and watched the prosecution's case undergo the specific, irreversible collapse of a structure that had been built on a single false premise, not dramatically, not with visible chaos, but with the slow, grinding inevitability of something that had never actually been as solid as it looked. The inside source's testimony was subsequently challenged not on its content, but on its context. A man who had been communicating with Shin Woo-jin for 16 months, who had received payments routed through the same Singapore firm that had incorporated Heian Capital, was not a credible independent witness. He was a participant in the same fabrication he'd been presenting as revelation. Kim Woo-seok requested a recess. The judge granted it. Mia sat at the defense table and looked at her notes, and did not allow herself to feel anything until there was something definitive to feel it about. Kwon Sung-jin put his hand on the table between them. Not touching her hand, simply present 3 inches from hers, in the specific way of a man who had spent 13 years learning how to be a father to someone who needed presence more than performance. She put her hand over his. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing in that moment that words would have added. The charges were dismissed at the preliminary stage. A rare outcome, and one that the legal press covered with the intensity of people who had not expected to be writing about a landmark evidentiary collapse in the most high-profile case of the year. Kim Woo-seok's office issued a statement about ongoing investigations. The Shin organization released nothing publicly, but Dae-hyun reported 48 hours later that Shin Woo-jin had been removed from his position in the infrastructure division by his own father, and that the elder Shin had made a private communication to Kwon Sung-jin that Dae-hyun described as an apology in everything but the literal use of that word. Shin Jae-hoon's role in the outcome was not publicly known. Mia knew. She had kept her word about the distinction. The documentation she'd introduced implicated Woo-jin specifically, with no material connecting it to the elder Shin's knowledge or authorization, because the evidence genuinely supported that distinction, and she had never, in her professional life, misrepresented evidence in either direction. She thought about him occasionally in the weeks after, about the particular thing it cost a person to hand evidence against their own blood to the opposing side because it was the right thing to do. She had never encountered that particular kind of integrity at such personal cost, and she found it stayed with her in a way she wasn't entirely sure what to do with yet. She wasn't in a hurry to decide. She had learned from a man who had stood in the rain for 40 minutes rather than step over a sleeping child and keep walking, that the most important things generally waited for you to be ready for them. 3 weeks after the dismissal, Kwon Sung-jin asked Mia to have dinner with him at the same Taeokbokki restaurant he had taken her to on the night they met, a small place on the east side that had no business being as good as it was, and that he had been quietly ensuring stayed in business for 13 years through a combination of regular patronage and what he described as favorable neighborhood conditions, and what Mia had always understood to mean something considerably more interventionist. They sat across from each other in a booth that was slightly too small for a man of his build and a woman of her professional reputation, eating food that was exactly as good as she'd remembered from the first time, and for a while neither of them said anything that required the other to respond. Then Kwon Sung-jin said, "I learned differential equations for you. I want you to know that. I told Dae-hyun it was for a business application. He knew I was lying. He was kind enough not to say so." Mia looked up at him. "I know," she said. "I found the textbook in your office when I was 14. You'd annotated the whole thing." "You never said anything." "I didn't know what to say." She put down her chopsticks. "I didn't know how to tell a man who ran half of Seoul's criminal underground that I'd seen his differential equations homework and that it was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for me." Kwon Sung-jin looked at his food for a moment, and Mia understood, watching him, that 30 years of building something impenetrable had not, in the end, made him impenetrable to this, to the specific, disarming truth of being loved by someone who had seen him at his most unguarded and found him worth loving anyway. "You didn't have to come back," he said finally. "When I was arrested, you had a career. You had a life you'd built that had nothing to do with what I am. You came back every night," Mia said, "for 13 years, even the nights when the business kept you late, even the nights when I was impossible to deal with, which was frequently. You came back." She looked at him with the straightforward clarity she brought to everything and everything she'd built since a November night under a bridge. "I didn't have to come back. I wanted to. There's a difference, and you taught me that difference, so I think you probably already understand it." He looked at her for a long time, the man who had built an empire and nearly lost it, being looked at by the child he had chosen on the other side of 13 years of everything a father and daughter could give each other. "You're better at this than I am," he said. "At the law?" "At all of it," he said. "At being a person." Mia picked up her chopsticks. "I had a good teacher," she said. "He found me under a bridge and bought me teokbokki and learned differential equations for me. I've been trying to live up to that ever since." Kwon Sung-jin did not say anything else for a while. He didn't need to. Some things, Mia had learned. The things that mattered most, the things that were built under bridges in the rain and in courtrooms and in booths and restaurants, too small for the size of what was happening in them, didn't need words to be real. They simply were, the way the most solid structures were, not because they'd been announced, but because they'd been built piece by piece over time by people who showed up even when it was harder than walking away. If this story moved you, I want to know about it in the comments. And subscribe if you haven't yet, because this is what we do here every single week, and I want you here for the next one. Thank you for watching. I'll see you soon.